Good afternoon. This is your captain speaking with just a little flight information. We're flying at an altitude of 37,000 feet and our airspeed is 400 miles an hour. Couple little facts here. I'm packing a Colt King Cobra. That's a .357 caliber firearm with a black rubber grip and a 6-inch barrel, capable of piercing body armor at a distance of up to 27 feet, and it can put a hole in human bone and flesh the size of the Grand Canyon, which, by the way, is coming up on the left-hand side of the plane. So just sit back and relax and enjoy the rest of the flight.
No, not you. Not you. Your organization's terrible. Should I tell you? Should I tell you? Oh, you're Boy Scouts, but you know life. You know life. You know I'm totally off script right now.
Hello, this is News Dive, and I'm your host, Shane. It is Thursday, July 20th, 2023, and let's dive into the headlines. Republicans have yet to produce any evidence of actual wrongdoing by Hunter Biden, so they let Marjorie Taylor Greene wave his nude photos around Wednesday during a House Oversight Committee hearing on his taxes. House Republicans have for months accused the Bidens of corruption and other forms of wrongdoing, although they have yet to produce any actual evidence. In her desperation to prove wrongdoing by Hunter Biden, Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene may have sent his nude photos to minors. The Georgia representative emailed her constituents on Wednesday evening claiming she had confirmed Biden was guilty of sex trafficking and tax fraud. She had not. The email included a video that showed his nudes. There is no screening for age when signing up for Greene's email newsletter, so any minors who subscribe, such as for a social studies project or simply to stay up to date, have now received nudes from their congresswoman. If that is the case, then Greene would not only have violated her state's revenge porn law, but she have also broken federal laws banning distribution of obscene material to minors. Children incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola Prison have been locked in windowless cells for nearly 24 hours a day without air conditioning as heat indexes in the area reach up to 133 degrees. An analysis released Wednesday by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office estimates that House Republicans' proposed cuts to federal spending for the coming fiscal year would kill 500,000 jobs and hinder economic growth, finding that Democrats seized on as further evidence of the GOP's willful disregard for the well-being of Americans. 200 members of the United States Congress have committed to not step in if the United Parcel Service workers represented by the International Brotherhood of Teamsters goes on strike next month. New York City reached a historic settlement this week on behalf of more than 1,300 people who were attacked by police while protesting the police killing of George Floyd in 2020. The plaintiffs claimed that the New York Police Department violated protesters' civil and constitutional rights by making mass arrests, using excessive force, using pepper spray improperly, and using a tactic called kettling to trap and arrest protesters ahead of an imposed curfew. The proposed settlement will pay out $13 million to 13,080 protesters, about $10,000 per person, the largest total payout to protesters in a class action suit in the United States. The Senate on Wednesday overwhelmingly voted down an amendment to the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act that would declare NATO's Article 5, which outlines mutual defense commitments, does not override congressional war powers. The amendment, introduced by Senator Rand Paul, states it is the sense of Congress that Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty does not supersede the constitutional requirement that Congress declare war before the United States engages in war. Educators, historians, and civil rights leaders were among those who on Thursday condemned Florida's new K-12 history curriculum as a big step backwards for teaching that slavery gave African Americans beneficial skills, and for what critics argue is a disproportionate focus on black violence. After preserving a tax benefit for investment managers last year, Senator Kyrsten Sinema continues to rely on investment industry donors as she faces a Democratic challenger in a possible 2024 re-election campaign. A study of 15 artificial intelligence companies found that AI gig workers on the 5 most used platforms make an average of $2.15 an hour. The AI revolution is being powered by exploited workers. And that will conclude today's headlines. Skies on the US East Coast turned an apocalyptic orange in early June as wildfire smoke from Canada blew south. On Wednesday, June 7th, New York City's air quality ranked the worst in the world, with an air quality index rating of more than 400 out of 500, deemed hazardous for any individual. Scientists expect forest fires to increase with the advance of climate disruption, mainly driven by fossil fuel consumption. Hotter, drier weather, an increase in the type of brush that fuels these fires, and more frequent lightning strikes all contribute to this outcome. Short-term exposure to fine particulate matter in wildfire smoke can cause nose, throat, and lung irritation, as well as worsening underlying conditions like asthma and heart disease. Over months or years, this exposure can increase chances of chronic bronchitis, as well as hospital admissions and deaths due to conditions like lung cancer and heart disease. In Delhi, India, which typically has the worst air quality in the world, pollution takes an average of 9 years off residents' life expectancy. With a sepia hue and the smell of a campfire engulfing the East Coast, the immediate effects of human-caused climate change seemed as concrete as they have ever been. But on US TV news, viewers were more likely to hear climate denial than reporting that made the essential connection between fossil fuel consumption and worsening wildfires, if they heard mention of climate change at all. Searching the Nexus News database for transcripts from June 5th through 9th on ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, FAIR found that 115 news segments that mentioned the forest fires and their effects on air quality. Of those 115 segments, only 44, or 38%, mentioned climate change's role. Outlets varied widely in attention to the wildfire pollution issue. The broadcast outlets ranged from 20 segments at CBS to 10 at ABC and 3 at NBC. Among cable outlets, CNN had 55 segments, Fox had 23, and MSNBC had 4. At MSNBC, it was mentioned in 3 out of 4 segments, and in 2 out of 3 segments on NBC. Climate change was mentioned in 48% of segments at Fox, 40% at ABC and CNN, and 10% at CBS. Even when outlets mentioned climate change, the details and usefulness of the information varied greatly. Only 7 wildfire pollution segments, 6% of all 115, named or even alluded to fossil fuels, by far the largest contributor to climate change, in a way that did not engage in climate denial. By disconnecting climate change causes and consequences, media outlets shield the fossil fuel industry and the politicians who aid and abet them from accountability, and avoid discussions about urgently needed action. Of the 44 segments that mentioned climate change in relation to wildfire pollution, 10 did so only in passing, with no detail as to how exactly climate change increases the risk, severity, and duration of such fires. For instance, CNN Tonight, on June 6th, referred to the air quality in New York City as a climate crisis, but went no further into discussing how the broader climate crisis is exacerbating events like these. CNN's Poppy Harlow, on June 8th, remarked on how important it is that we focus on climate change and all that is happening, but said nothing else to direct the audience's focus in that direction. ABC also had 2 passing mentions, as when World News Tonight on June 7th aired a soundbite from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre describing the smoke as yet another alarming example of the ways in which the climate crisis is disturbing our lives and our community. Then the segment ended. Though a passing mention is better than no mention at all, tossing in the term climate change does very little to help audience understand how climate disruption exacerbates events like these, or to explain the human causes of the climate crisis. This silence deprives viewers of any conversation about potential climate solutions or mitigations, leaving them only with confusion and fear. 10 segments in the study period engaged in outright climate change denial, either mocking or attempting to debunk climate change with pseudoscience. These segments were less helpful than not mentioning climate change at all, actively discouraging people from taking action to ameliorate the climate catastrophe. CNN aired an interview with Mike Pence, who claimed climate change isn't happening as dramatically as the radical environmentalists like to present, and that the solution is expanding American energy and national gas. He faced no pushback for his scientifically illiterate response. But, as usual, Fox led the climate disinformation with 9 denialist segments. Jesse Walters offered a typical example.
A liberal in Canada goes camping, starts a forest fire, smokes out America, and they tell us to pay Elon Musk. But is man-made global warming causing Canadian forest fires? Why don't you open a history book and you'll learn about New England's Dark Day. It happened in 1780, long before the Industrial Revolution. A dark cloud stretched from Maine to New Jersey, blotting out the sun. People thought it was the end of times. The sun might never come out again. They had to use candles at noon to get around because it was so dark. Eventually it passed and everything was okay. That dark cloud in 1780 was from Canadian wildfires 240 years ago. Can't blame that on climate change. Everybody was riding horses. And you might be surprised to find out, over the last 100 years, there have been less wildfires, not more. The Wall Street Journal says in the early 1900s, about 4% of land worldwide burned every year. By 2021, that was down to 2.5%. So instead of obsessing over climate change, they should take a look at forest management and making sure Canadian campers listen to Smokey the Bear.
The Wall Street Journal op-ed Walters cited is by a climate denialist, and misleadingly only takes into account the metric of land burned, ignoring factors like the severity and frequency of more recent fires, and the likelihood of land burned trending back upward. The World Resource Institute found that forest fires burned nearly twice as much tree coverage globally in 2021 than it did in 2001. Blaming fires solely on poor forest management despite clear links to climate change was a common tactic at Fox. Laura Ingraham argued that because forest fires are so normal that Canada's government website page has devoted to educating the public about them, that concern over these out-of-control fires is hysteria. In reality, Canada is having its worst ever wildfire season. In early June, more than 200 wildfires burned across Canada, accompanied in some areas by record heat. More than half were out of control. Earlier in the week, Ingraham's guest, Steve Malloy of the conservative climate-denying Energy and Environmental Legal Institute, claimed there's no health risk from wildfire smoke, and that there's no public health emergencies in countries like India and China due to their low air quality. Also a lie, air pollution was responsible for nearly 18% of deaths in India in 2019, and causes an estimated 2 million deaths in China per year. He argued that wildfire smoke is natural, and not because of climate change.
Look, the air is ugly, it's unpleasant to breathe, and for a lot of people they get anxiety over it. But the reality is there's no health risk. Okay, there's EPA research. They've done lots of clinical research on asthmatics, on elderly asthmatics, on children, on elderly with heart disease. Not a cough or a wheeze from any of them. We have this kind of air in India and China all the time. No public health emergency.
Speaking of, do you notice, like in all the coverage of, Bill Ware, the tailpipes, all this stuff, They never, ever mentioned the fact at the top that China is the #1 polluter in the world. Never.
Yeah, this is like clean air in China. I mean, it's really bad. They in the winter, they never turn on their scrubbers for the air pollution because they don't care. Weir has no idea what he's talking about. This doesn't kill anybody. This doesn't make anybody cough. This is not a health event. This has got nothing to do with climate. First off, this is wildfire smoke. This is natural. This is not because of climate change.
It's
not
amazing.
because of a fossil fuel, internal combustion engines. He just has no idea what he's talking about.
All day, by the way, it seemed like the media figures that we've become accustomed to seeing on television during these crises, they seemed like they were back in their element and kind of almost enjoying the moment of wearing masks again, didn't they? They seemed to have a little pep in their step with those masks. Now, they talked about the dangers of something called particulate matter from the smoke.
Yeah, this is crazy. This is all particulate matter, but particulate matter was not a concern until EPA invented it as one in the 1990s, and they've been riding it, the Obama administration, now the Biden administration.
Well, what is it? Is it a health concern?
No, particulate matter is very fine soot.
Well, you don't want to be breathing that in all day.
They're just carbon particles. They're innocuous. Okay, by them, they're innocuous. There's nothing in them. They have no effect. The EPA has all this testing on real live human beings that shows no effect. This is total junk science.
For more on Steve Malloy and his right-wing war on clean air, please check out the episode, The Right-Wing War on Clean Air, from June 12th. Fox also applied its typical Red Scare tactics, saying climate concern is about socialism, and that the climate crazies are trying to use Canadian forest fires as yet another excuse to take your freedom, take your power, and take your money. Meanwhile, Fox misled viewers that mainstream media coverage of fires was rife with discussions about the climate crisis. On The Five, Greg Gutfeld complained, so, already, the media is blaming climate change. ABC is connecting it to climate change. USA Today asked if the fires were actually caused by climate change. If only centrist corporate outlets were as committed to offering climate crisis context as Fox is to promoting climate change denial. 12 other segments that mentioned climate change offered a slightly better than passing mention, explaining things like how a warmer and drier climate exacerbates these fires, or how events like these will worsen as the climate crisis continues. But these segments did not allude to the reality that climate change is caused by people. Some of these segments included the sparest of explanations, as when ABC's Rob Marciano briefly mentioned climate change with the extra warmth amplifying these fires and potentially contributing to weather systems that kept the smoke hanging over the northeastern US. 3 mentions from the lead, Situation Room, and CNN Newsroom were the same brief soundbites from Daniel Westervelt, anti-pollution advisor to the US State Department, warning, with increasing climate change and increasing warming, we can expect more and more of these kinds of wildfires to continue. CNN climate correspondent Bill Weir offered perhaps the most thorough explanation of how the climate crisis worsens wildfires, demonstrating the connection to the melting ice in the Arctic.
The Arctic, the northern top of the planet, has been warming up 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. And when I do those reports, I can almost hear the viewer's eyes is glazing over, like, what do I care about what happens in the Arctic? This is directly related to that. There was a heat anomaly in May over Canada. It looked like a giant red blob of paint where they had temperatures in the high 90s, way sooner than is normal. That dries things out. One lightning strike sets that off like a tinder box, and that's why there's over 100 fires burning in central Quebec. And then the weather patterns connect us. Now we're breathing the results of a climate in crisis. And
Weir went on to briefly mention the cost of doing nothing. However, he was referring entirely to the economic impact of people not being able to leave their homes on poor air quality days. While he thoroughly explained the connection between a warming planet and devastating wildfires, he did not elaborate on the human causes, nor the human solutions to the climate crisis. 5 of the 44 segments that mentioned climate change did point to human responsibility for climate change, either directly or by mentioning the need to reduce emissions. But these segments did not reference fossil fuels, which are the main way humans are changing the climate and the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Thus, Fox aired a soundbite of New York City Mayor Eric Adams saying we must continue to draw down emissions, without remarking on Adams' comment. On CNN Newsroom, climate scientist Zeke Housefather briefly said, "I hope it will serve as a wake-up call that we need to cut emissions and reduce the impacts going forward." Other segments that described or alluded to the climate crisis as human-caused without mentioning fossil fuels, including CNN's Lead, MSNBC's All In, and CNN This Morning. The fossil fuel distinction is important, especially because the industry has spent billions to confuse the public on its environmental impact. In the early 2000s, a PR firm for BP coined the term carbon footprint, diverting the blame of the climate crisis onto individual citizens and away from these greedy corporations. We can sip our iced coffee out of paper straws all we want, but unless the world's economies immediately and drastically cut fossil fuels, the planet is headed to far exceed the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise scientists have warned about. All of these segments that took the crucial next step of connecting the wildfires to fossil fuel emissions, 7 in all, appeared on cable news networks. On MSNBC's The Readout, host Joy Reid called out the world's unrelenting dependence on oil.
These kinds of weather phenomena are happening all around the globe, and it's only becoming more and more common, all because of climate change. And even as we barrel towards a climate catastrophe, many world leaders are still wary of any substantial climate action because of their unrelenting dependence on oil. And among the world's top oil suppliers is Canada, as well as the U.S. And of course, there's Saudi Arabia. Their massive oil supply has made them one of the richest nations in the world. The Saudis are so rich off oil, they're actually buying up parts of the U.S., buildings, businesses, and now apparently golf, as the PGA just announced their merger with Saudi Arabia's Live Golf franchise. All of this despite the fact that their government played a role in funding the September 11 terrorist attacks, as well as brutally murdering Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi and hacking up his body with a bone saw. These are the people who are eating off our addiction to oil. And as long as we stay addicted, they will not only get richer and gobble up more and more of our industries and our culture, we will suffer the consequences as the planet we live on and that our children and grandchildren will inherit becomes even more dangerous to live in. You'd think it'd be a priority to keep breathing.
Environmentalist Bill McKibben appeared on CNN Newsroom to link the poor quality of New York's air to the dire situations facing people across the world as the result of fossil fuel-driven pollution. It's terrible in New York right now, and we shouldn't make light of it, but it's precisely how most people across much of the world live every single day. That's why 9 million people a year, 1 death in 5 on this planet, come from the effects of breathing fossil fuel combustion. Beyond fear-mongering, McKibben offered a solution. The good news is we have an easy fix. We now live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. We should be in an all-out effort to move to renewable energy and to save energy so we don't have to use as much of it. Another segment that day, CNN Newsroom discussed the American Lung Association's report that stated 90,000 lives would be saved if the US could electrify its vehicle fleet by 2050. That doesn't account for the prevalence of wildfire smoke, now more common on a planet heated up by fossil fuels, CNN chief climate correspondent Weir reported. Elsewhere, Weir attributed India's poor air quality to coal burning, unchecked motor regulations, and the burning of agricultural fields. And on his MSNBC show, Alex Wagner called out Republicans' efforts to defend a household source of fossil fuel emissions, even as the wildfires demonstrated the dire effects of unchecked climate disruption. House Republicans had an agenda item on the topic of air quality, but it had nothing to do with combating climate change. They were taking a vote on protecting gas stoves. When the best mainstream TV news outlets have to offer during an environmental and public health crisis is 7 mentions of the key calls that needs to be urgently addressed, there's little for the public to gain. In a recent segment on Democracy Now!, Genevieve Gunther, author and director of End Climate Silence, emphasized the importance of these connections, advocating for all reporters to be educated on the climate crisis. regardless of the beat they cover.
You need to connect the dots to from what you're reporting to the climate crisis, and then through the climate crisis to the use of fossil fuels that is heating up our planet. So, for example, most of the stories on the wildfire smoke would talk about the unprecedented wildfires that are raging across Canada right now. And some of them even discussed the heat and the drought that's been creating this fire weather north of the United States, but none of them actually articulated the words climate change, and they didn't explain that it is the ongoing use of fossil fuels that is putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and creating these conditions for these extreme weather events, these disasters, which are already affecting Americans' health, Americans' safety, Americans' ability to live normal lives. So our job and the job of the news media is to every story make those connections between what's being reported and the reality of the crisis, because if you don't do that, you're actually performing a kind of climate denial where you are pretending that something that is happening is not happening, where you are proceeding as if the climate crisis weren't already here and weren't already hurting us, hurting our children, hurting our ability to live normal lives and be healthy.
It is necessary to go beyond courtesy headlines to name what is responsible, not to further fear and complicity, but because doing so allows us to offer solutions. We live in a time where, despite big oil's tireless efforts to confuse the public, renewable energy is cheaper and by many measures more efficient than fossil fuels. A 2022 study shows that news framing that centers credible responses to climate problems were associated with confidence in one's ability to make changes and more support for collective action. If apocalyptic air enveloping major news headquarters hundreds of miles away from record-setting fires doesn't prompt these necessary conversations, what will? And that will conclude today's episode. Please like and follow the show, leave 5 stars and a good review, and share the episode around. Follow the show on social media, and I will talk to you next time. Bye-bye.